The wagon wheels ground to a halt in the frozen mud, and Celeste Whitmore knew her life had just shattered like ice on a winter pond. This was not the prosperous ranch described in Ezra Blackwood's letters. This was a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the endless Montana sky, looking as if the next wind might scatter them like tumbleweeds. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled correspondence that had promised comfort, security, a gentle husband who would treat her with kindness. Instead, she stared at a man whose shoulders filled the doorway of a cabin that seemed to lean with exhaustion. His dark hair caught the pale sunlight, and even from this distance, she could see the wariness in his stance. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will blow your mind. But it was the small figure that appeared beside him that made Celeste's breath catch in her throat. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, with tangled auburn curls and a dress that had seen too many washings. The child's eyes held a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the mother-shaped emptiness that Celeste recognized in her own soul. The wagon driver deposited her single trunk with unnecessary force, the thud echoing across the silent yard like a funeral bell. Celeste stepped down into the mud, her traveling boots immediately swallowed by the frozen mire. The reality of her situation settled around her like a shroud. She had traded her position as a seamstress in Chicago for this desolate place, driven by desperation and her aunt's cutting words about becoming a burden. Ezra Blackwood approached with measured steps, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Up close, she could see the lines carved by harsh winters and harder losses. His eyes held depth she could not fathom, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had learned to expect disappointment. "Miss Whitmore," he said simply. The words hung between them like an unfinished prayer. The little girl pressed closer to her father's side, peering at Celeste with curious eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. Her dress, though clean, bore the careful patches of someone trying to make things last. Celeste's heart twisted unexpectedly at the sight of those tiny fingers clutching at Ezra's coat. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the stone fireplace did little to chase away the chill that had settled in Celeste's bones. The interior was sparse but clean, with hand-hewn furniture that spoke of a man's practical touch. A quilt draped over the single chair showed faded patches where loving hands had mended tears, and Celeste wondered about the woman who had once called this place home. "This is Ruby," Ezra said, his hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder. "Ruby, this is Miss Whitmore. She's come to stay with us." The child studied Celeste with the intensity of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Her auburn curls caught the firelight, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you going to be my mama now?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with hope and fear. Celeste felt something crack open in her chest, a place she had kept carefully guarded since leaving Chicago. She knelt down to Ruby's level, meeting those earnest eyes that held too much understanding for such a young soul. The child's dress smelled of wood smoke and something sweetly innocent that made Celeste's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Celeste reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing Ruby's cheek. The child's skin was soft as rose petals, and she leaned into the touch with a hunger that broke Celeste's heart. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she whispered, "but I'm here now." Ezra cleared his throat, the sound rough with emotion he seemed determined to contain. "Ruby's mother passed 2 winters ago," he said quietly. "Fever took her quick. Ruby doesn't remember much, but she asks about having a mama sometimes." The cabin felt smaller suddenly, filled with the weight of grief and longing. Celeste could see it in the way Ezra's jaw tightened, in the careful distance he maintained from both her and his daughter. This was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, who had built walls around his heart like the sturdy logs that formed these walls. Ruby tugged on Celeste's skirt with small, insistent fingers. "Will you read to me? Mama used to read stories before the angels took her away." The simple request pierced through Celeste's uncertainty like sunlight through storm clouds. She looked up at Ezra, seeing something flicker across his weathered features before he turned away to tend the fire. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Celeste found herself sitting beside Ruby on the narrow bed tucked into the corner. The child had produced a worn book of fairy tales, its pages soft from countless readings. The firelight danced across the illustrations as Celeste's voice filled the quiet space with stories of princesses and magic. Ruby's head grew heavy against her shoulder, and Celeste felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. She had never imagined herself as a mother, had been told by her aunt that her practical nature and plain features made her unsuitable for such tender roles. Yet here was this precious child, trusting her with bedtime stories and sleepy confidences. From across the room, she felt Ezra's gaze upon them. When she looked up, she caught something unguarded in his expression, a longing so raw it made her breath catch. He turned away quickly, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. "You'll sleep in my bed tonight," Ruby announced drowsily. "Papa can sleep by the fire like he always does." The arrangement spoke volumes about the careful boundaries this broken family had constructed, and Celeste wondered how long it had been since any of them had truly felt at home. Dawn came with the sound of wind rattling the shutters, and Ruby's small body curled trustingly against Celeste's side. The child's breathing was soft and even, her auburn curls spread across the pillow like spun copper. Celeste lay still, afraid to disturb this moment of peace, watching the pale light creep through the gaps in the wooden walls. From the main room came the quiet sounds of Ezra moving about, building up the fire, preparing for another day of hard work. She could hear him speaking softly to the animals outside, his voice carrying a gentleness he seemed to reserve for creatures who could not judge him. Ruby stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet Celeste's gaze. "Good morning, little one," Celeste whispered, brushing a curl from the child's forehead. "Will you stay forever?" Ruby asked with the directness only children possessed. The question hung between them like morning mist, fragile and impossible to grasp. Before Celeste could answer, Ezra's voice called from the kitchen. "Ruby, come help with breakfast. Miss Whitmore needs her rest." But Celeste was already rising, smoothing her rumpled dress. "I can help," she called back, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The kitchen was little more than a corner of the main room, but Celeste moved through it with practiced efficiency, her seamstress fingers adapting quickly to the unfamiliar tasks. She found flour and eggs, salt pork hanging from the rafters, and soon had biscuits browning in the cast iron Dutch oven, while bacon sizzled in the pan. Ezra stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to prove anything," Celeste replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm trying to be useful." Ruby appeared at her elbow, standing on a wooden crate to reach the table. "Can I help?" she asked eagerly, and Celeste found herself smiling despite the tension that crackled between the adults. "Of course, sweetheart. You can set the plates." As they worked together, Celeste caught glimpses of what this family might have been, could still become. Ruby chattered about the chickens and the barn cat, her face bright with the simple pleasure of having someone listen. And Ezra, despite his careful reserve, found excuses to linger near the kitchen, his presence both comforting and unsettling. The storm struck without warning on Celeste's third day at the ranch. What had begun as gentle snowfall turned vicious by afternoon, wind howling around the cabin like a living thing intent on tearing it apart. Ruby pressed close to Celeste's side as they watched through the frosted window, the world beyond disappearing into a wall of white. Ezra burst through the door, his coat crusted with ice, his face grim with worry. "The cattle," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Half the herd's still out in the north pasture. I have to bring them in or we'll lose them all." Celeste saw the fear in Ruby's eyes, the way the child's small hand gripped her skirt. "You can't go out in this," she said to Ezra, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I don't have a choice," he replied, already reaching for extra rope. "Those cattle are all we have left." The weight of their precarious situation settled over Celeste like the storm itself. This wasn't just about today's crisis, but about survival through the long winter ahead. She watched Ezra prepare to face the killing wind, and something fierce awakened in her chest, something that felt suspiciously like the need to protect this fractured family. "Take Ruby to the root cellar if the roof starts to give," Ezra said, pulling on his heaviest gloves. "There's enough food stored there to last a week if needed." Ruby's face crumpled with terror. "Papa, don't go. The storm will eat you up like it ate the other cowboys." Ezra knelt before his daughter, his weathered hands gentle on her small shoulders. "I'll come back, little one. I promise." But promises, Celeste knew, were fragile things that winter winds could shatter like icicles. She watched him disappear into the white fury, then turned to Ruby, who was sobbing into her hands. "Come here, sweetheart," Celeste whispered, gathering the child close. Let's keep the fire burning bright so Papa can find his way home. They spent the endless hours feeding logs to the flames, Celeste telling stories to distract Ruby from the howling wind and the terrible silence beyond it. But her own heart hammered with each gust that shook the cabin, with each minute that passed without Ezra's return. When Ruby finally fell asleep in her arms, Celeste stared into the fire and made bargains with a god she had nearly forgotten, promising anything if he would just bring this stubborn, wounded man safely home. Near midnight, when Celeste had almost given up hope, the door crashed open and Ezra stumbled inside, more ice than man. His lips were blue with cold, his movements clumsy with exhaustion, but his eyes were alive with triumph. "Got them all," he gasped through chattering teeth. Celeste flew to him without thinking, her hands working to strip away his frozen coat. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, but her voice broke with relief. She guided him to the fire, wrapping him in every blanket she could find. Ruby woke and launched herself at her father, tears streaming down her face. "I thought the storm ate you," she sobbed against his chest. Ezra's arms came around his daughter, then somehow around Celeste too, pulling them both close to his warming body. In that moment, with the storm still raging outside but safety wrapped around them like a cocoon, something shifted in the very air of the cabin. "Thank you," Ezra said quietly, his words meant for Celeste though his eyes never left his daughter's face. "For staying, for caring for her." But Celeste knew the truth that was blooming in her chest like wildflowers after rain. She wasn't just caring for Ruby anymore. She was caring for them both, and somehow, miraculously, they were caring for her too. The days that followed the storm passed in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Celeste found herself moving through the cabin as if she had always belonged there, mending Ruby's torn dress with careful stitches, teaching the child to knead bread dough, sharing quiet conversations by the fire while Ezra worked on harness repairs. One evening, as Ruby played with her corn-husk doll near the hearth, Ezra approached Celeste with something awkward in his manner. "I know this isn't what you expected," he said quietly. "The letters I wrote, they painted a prettier picture than the truth." Celeste looked up from her sewing, meeting his honest gaze. "The truth is better than any pretty picture," she replied. "The truth is Ruby laughing at my silly stories. The truth is you risking your life for those cattle because you refused to let your family go hungry." His breath caught at the word family, and she saw the moment he realized she had included herself in it without reservation. When he reached for her hand, his fingers were warm and calloused from honest work, and she did not pull away. "Will you marry me, Celeste? Not because of letters or arrangements, but because I think we could build something real here." "Yes," Celeste whispered, the word carrying all the hope she had thought lost forever. Ruby looked up from her doll, her eyes bright with understanding beyond her years. "Does this mean you'll really be my mama now?" she asked, scrambling to her feet. Celeste knelt down, opening her arms wide. "If you'll have me, sweetheart, forever and always." Ruby threw herself into the embrace with the abandon of a child who had finally found her safe harbor. Over the little girl's head, Celeste met Ezra's gaze and saw her own wonder reflected there. They had all been broken in different ways, but somehow their jagged edges had fitted together to create something beautiful and whole. The spring wedding was small, witnessed only by the traveling preacher and a handful of neighbors who had come to understand that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil. As Celeste spoke her vows, Ruby stood beside them in a new dress sewn from Celeste's own blue calico, her small hand clasped tightly in theirs. Have you ever found belonging in unexpected places? Tell us about your moment of acceptance in the comments below. Years later, when the ranch had grown prosperous and Ruby had siblings to chase through the meadows, Celeste would remember that first horrifying day and marvel at how perfectly wrong first impressions could be.